Assalamu alaikum dear students. Welcome to the course Principle in Animal Life 2. This is lecture number 45. The topic is Reproductive Isolation. Discussing agenda for the topic will be Reproductive Isolation, Prezygotic Barriers, Post-Zygotic Barriers, lecture outcome. After watching and listening this lecture, students will know about various stages where reproductive isolation is ensured between different species. Reproductive isolation. If you recall from our previous lecture, we discussed different species concepts. Our prime focus was on biological species concept, which is the most favorite definition of biologists and zoologists. The definition says that a species is a group of individuals that can interbreed and produce fertile, viable offsprings and cannot breed with members of other species and produce fertile offsprings. So what actually happens is that the two species does not come close together and perform the act of mating and fertilization because there are certain barriers, certain physical barriers, ecological barriers, mechanical barriers, behavioral barriers that prevents the members of two different species to come close together and mate with each other. Reproductive isolation also leads to speciation, where new species arises when two populations are separated from each other by a physical barrier, and it is impossible for the members of the two populations to migrate and join each other and reproduce. Then what happens that with the passage of time, the genetic composition of the two populations changes and eventually they evolve into two different species. Because biological species are defined in terms of reproductive compatibility, the formation of a new species hinges on reproductive isolation. So, a single population will split into two different species if some of its members migrate to other areas, and then the members of the original parent population are unable to interact with those outgoing individuals, and with the passage of time they will develop differences and there will be a lack of gene flow. Usually gene flow is responsible for maintaining the similarities between two populations on genetic level, but if there is no gene flow, then these differences tends to increase with the passage of time. Reproductive isolation is the existence of biological factors that impede members of two species from interbreeding and producing viable fertile offspring. So, reproductive isolation prevents the members of two species to mate with each other and produce fertile offsprings. Such barriers block gene flow between the species and limit the formation of hybrids. Hybrids are the offsprings that result from an interspecific mating means two species that are closely related with each other. They at times can mate and produce viable hybrids, like horse and donkey can mate and produce mule. Similarly, tiger and lion can mate and produce liger. But if there are physical barriers or biological barriers, then it prevents the two species from mating. Although a single barrier may not prevent all gene flow, a combination of several barriers can effectively isolate a species gene pool. So there are various stages at which the reproductive isolation is ensured. In the subsequent slides, we will discuss it in detail. We will discuss prezygotic barriers and then post-zygotic barriers, different stages where this isolation is ensured. Clearly, a fly cannot mate with a frog or a fern. Fern is a pteridophyte, a plant, but the reproductive barriers between more closely related species are not so obvious. Means fly and frog have lot of differences between them. One is an arthropod, an invertebrate, and the other is a vertebrate from class Amphibia, and this one is a plant species. Obviously they have so many differences with each other that they cannot mate with each other even if they are so much close to each other. But on the other hand, some species are so closely related with each other that it becomes difficult to prevent them from mating. The barriers can be classified according to whether they contribute to reproductive isolation before or after fertilization. So, reproductive isolation can be ensured before fertilization when the behaviors of two species are different. They will not mate with each other. When their reproductive structures are not compatible, they will not mate with each other. When they reside in different areas, they will not mate with each other. So these are the barriers before fertilization, before the formation of zygote. Then there are barriers after fertilization. Suppose two different species were able to mate with each other and fertilization took place. So what happens after fertilization? Whether that zygote will develop into a young one, or there are still stages where the growth and development can be hampered. So there are also post-zygotic stages. Prezygotic means before the zygote, block fertilization from occurring between two different species. Such barriers typically act in one of three ways: by impeding members of different species from attempting to mate, means some factors which prevent the members of two species from mating with each other, and suppose if they mate with each other, then there are still other factors which prevent the success full outcome of this mating, means the fertilization, or by hindering fertilization if mating is completed successfully. So first, the prevention of the members of the two species to come close together and mate. Secondly, if they do come close together, then there is factors which impedes this process of mating, and even if mating is done and the gametes are released, then there are still other factors which prevents the fertilization and the fusion of those gametes. If a sperm cell from one species overcomes prezygotic barriers and fertilizes an ovum from another species, then what will happen? A variety of post-zygotic barriers may contribute to reproductive isolation after the hybrid zygote is formed. So let's suppose the members of two different species were able to come close together and mate successfully, and then even the fertilization of the gametes takes place. So what next? Is there any way where the development of the zygote can be hampered? So yes, developmental errors may reduce survival among hybrid embryos, because the hybrid embryo is a result of the mating event between two different species. Therefore, the gene complement, the chromosome complement is different in both species, and their combination is not ideal for the embryo. Or problem after birth may cause hybrids to be infertile or decrease their chance of surviving long enough to reproduce. So even the offspring is born, and then this offspring is genetically weaker, it lacks that vigor and strength, and it is unable to reach the maturity to reproduce and survive till that time. So now we are coming to various stages of prezygotic isolations. The first one is habitat isolation. Habitat isolation is when the two species live in different habitats, and therefore they does not encounter each other and cannot mate or reproduce. So they are occupying different habitats, although they are living in the same area, but because of the occupation of different habitats, these two species are unable to encounter each other to come face to face and mate. So it is also a barrier, although not as solid or large like mountain ranges or rivers or deserts, but it still prevents the act of mating between these two tiny species. So one of them feeds on hawthorns and apples, and the other one feeds upon blueberries. So therefore they are unable to encounter each other and mate. So in this way reproductive isolation between the two is ensured. Second is temporal isolation. Temporal refers to time, means the time where a species is receptive for mating is different. Two species are living in a particular area and their reproductive behavior starts at different times, at different stages. So even if one is ready, the other is not responsive because of the differences in the behaviors and the flow of the hormones that are responsible for this behavior. Species that breed at different times of the day, different seasons or different years cannot mix their gametes. Obviously in wild environment there is a specific reproductive behavior involved where the hormones play predominant role and the process of sexual selection takes place. So if all those events are not coordinated, then fertilization or the mating cannot happen. And obviously if the species are different, then those behavioral patterns will also be different, and it will minimize or decrease the chances of coming closer of two species and mating. So here you have an example in North America, the geographic ranges of the western spotted skunk and the eastern spotted skunk. But what happens, the time where the individuals are receptive for fertilization is different. One is receptive in summer season and the other is receptive in winter season. Their reproductive behaviors occurs at different times of the year, therefore it prevents mating between them. The third one is behavioral isolation. As already mentioned, that the individuals in wild environment chooses their mates on the basis of certain phenotypic features. And courtship is one of the behaviors that is predominantly practiced before mating, and courtship rituals attract mates and other behaviors unique to a species are effective reproductive barriers even between closely related species. So the courtship ritual is a specific sequence of behavioral patterns which can only be perceived and understood by the member of the same species of the opposite sex. So therefore, if the species are different, then this courtship behavior of one species cannot be perceived or understood correctly by the other species, and therefore a response cannot be initiated. Now, blue-footed bobbies, inhabitants of the Galapagos, mate only after a courtship display unique to their species. So they will only mate if they recognize their potential partner courtesy of their courtship behaviors. And there they have shown the behavioral patterns, the sequence of events where the male steps high and this behavior attracts the female's attention to his bright blue feet. Now, if it shows that behavior to a member of a different species of bird, then this different species will not be able to perceive it properly, to understand and interpret it properly. Mechanical isolation. Mechanical isolation is when the reproductive structures of the two species are different and they are incompatible to each other, then the gametes cannot be delivered to appropriate locations and therefore the fertilization cannot take place. Another is gametic isolation. Gametic isolation refers to the fact that gametes have certain proteins that act as recognition sites. For example, in humans, the human egg have ZP3 proteins. These proteins are present on the zona pellucida and they can only be recognized by the human sperm. And once the recognition is developed between the cell surface receptors of sperm and egg, then fertilization is ensured and the sperm is allowed to penetrate the egg. So similar thing happens in the wild environment, especially in the aquatic environments where there are hundreds of thousands of sperms flowing in the water and the eggs are laid in the sediments and then the egg releases chemicals which can only be recognized by the sperm of that particular species and the cell surface receptors also helps in the recognition of species specific sperms and eggs. Gametic isolation separates certain closely related species of aquatic animals such as sea urchins. This is an echinoderm. Sea urchin releases their sperm and eggs into the surrounding water where they fuse and form zygote. It is difficult for gamete of different species such as the red and purple urchins shown here to fuse because proteins on the surface of the eggs and sperm bind very poorly to each other. So the cell surface receptors, the receptors present on the surface of the egg and sperm, they are also species specific, and usually the recognition is established between the gametes of the same species. So if proper recognition is not established, then the sperm cannot penetrate the egg and fertilize it. Now, this is the example of post-zygotic barriers. Suppose the two species, different species, they came close together, they met with each other, the process of fertilization occurred, and then the hybrid was developed. Remember, hybrid is the product of two different species that are closely related to each other. So when hybrid is produced, the main problem with the hybrid is that its survival chances are extremely low because of the imbalances in the genetic material it has received from two parents that belong to two different species. And the hybrids are furthermore infertile, and they cannot reproduce on their own, and at times they cannot even reach the reproductive age. Another is reduced hybrid fertility. Even if hybrids are vigorous, even if the hybrids are strong and they survive the early scares of death, but they are then sterile, they cannot reproduce on their own. If the chromosomes of the two parent species differ in number of structure, meiosis in the hybrids may fail to produce normal gametes. So the parents belong to two different species, their genetic material is different, their chromosome complement is different, the gene located on the chromosomes are different. So the parents belonging to such diverse genetic background, when met together and produce the offsprings received a highly imbalanced genetic material, and because of this it is unable to reach the till birth, or unable to grow properly, or unable to become fertile, and is usually vulnerable to diseases, especially genetic disorders. Hybrid breakdown. Now, this is a process in which even a hybrid is fertile. The hybrid produces in a normal way in the first generation, but because of certain issues, the second generation of that hybrid is extremely weak. So those were the different barriers which prevent the mating between two different species, and these reproductive isolations, they play a role in speciations. Once this isolation is established between two different populations, then gene flow can no longer occur between them, and they can evolve into two different species. That's the end of it. Thank you very much.